Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how you can make and manage an SOP, a standard operating procedure, which is so much required right now during this COVID-19 times, using LuitBiz BPM. So this is the login screen of LuitBiz BPM. So let's sign into the system. Now in the system, in LuitBiz BPM, there are two types of users. One is the BPM manager user, the other is the BPM executive user. The manager user can make the templates for the SOP formats, and the executive user can fill in the SOP formats, get them approved by the other executive users or by the managers, and then once it is approved, the SOP format can be then shared with the other BPM users, who can then follow that format, and if there is any deviation pertaining to that particular SOP, those deviation forms can also be made in this BPM module and they can be attached as related forms. So the whole SOP process, starting from the making of the SOP templates till filling out of the SOP templates, getting them approved and making them approving them, and then making them confidential, making them the master controlled templates, everything can be done using this system. So let's see how it can be done. First of all, this particular user, John, is a BPM manager user, so he can first make the SOP form. So there are several things that he needs to configure first. He can define the different form categories. For example, we have already defined some form categories out here, like we have different categories of forms like CAPA forms, deviation forms, SOP forms, stuff like that. He can also, and these can be used and reused all the time. Same goes for drop down menus. So the BPM manager can define different drop-down menus. For example, he has already defined two types of drop-down menus called poll options and department. Suppose in this department he has this 10 different departments which he has defined. So this way he can define all these drop-down menus which can be used and reused in the different forms throughout this system. Then there are two types of forms out here. One is forms with workflow, the other is forms without workflow. So forms with workflow would be the SOP forms or the deviation forms or the CAPA forms, which need to go through a particular approval process, and this approval process can also be defined by the admin or by the BPM manager. And forms without workflow are the data entry forms which can be defined by the BPM manager, and the BPM executives can fill in data into those forms and share the data amongst the different other users. So since we are talking about SOP today, it's a form with workflow. So let's proceed here. So here, first he has to set up the different workflows. So he can add the workflow template out here. Adding a workflow template out here is pretty easy. You just have to go ahead and add the template, put in the template name, and then keep on adding the steps for the different template. So let's say this is a template for, let's say, SOP approval for equipment qualification. So let's see, suppose if there is an SOP made for equipment qualification, what would be the approval process that would be followed? So this is the process that the BPM manager is going to define. So he goes ahead in defining the workflow process. Let's say first step is, let's say, approval by let's say assistant manager of quality assurance. Let's say that's the first step, and this assistant manager can either accept, reject, or ask resubmission of the form. And who would be the assistant manager? Let's say this user called Mary is the assistant manager, and if there are any step instructions that the user needs to follow, the instructions can be written here, but it's an optional field. There is no red asterisk out here, so this can be skipped right now, and you can keep on adding as many steps as you want. Let's say the next step is, let's say, authorization by QA head. Suppose that's the final step, and let's say the QA head can either accept, reject, ask for resubmission, send for comment to someone else, and give final approval or authorization. And let's say John is the final approver, and here also if any step instructions are there, it can be written, but it's purely optional, so let's skip it. And let's say we are done with this workflow template. So now if we go to view templates, we will see that this particular template, SOP approval for equipment qualification, has been added. If we want to make any changes to it, we can do so. If we want to add more steps to it, we can also do so. And if you're not happy with the workflow, we can delete it. But suppose everything is fine, we go ahead and publish the workflow. So now this workflow is available to be attached to an SOP template. So now let's make the SOP template. So for that, since it's a form with workflow, you go to forms with workflow, add a form. So let's say the form is called SOP for equipment qualification. Suppose this is the template that we are going to make for SOP for equipment qualification. So let's give it a short form. Number of sections, let's say it has 2 sections. If there is a document that needs to be attached or that needs to be submitted with this SOP, we can specify how many documents can be submitted. If there is none, we can put a 0. That's not a problem. And then let's move on to the next step. So here we said 2 sections, so it is asking the names of the 2 sections. So let's say the first section is called header, and the type of section, let's say it's a sequential section. We can have sequential forms or we can have tabular forms. So let's say first is the header, and second one is, let's say we call it SOP details, and let's say this also is a sequential format. So moving on. So now since we said both are sequential, so now it's asking how many fields would these sections have. Let's say the first section has 6 fields, and the second section, let's say it has 7 fields. You can have as many as you want, there's no limit on that. All you have to do is put in a number out here. So once you do that, now it is asking you which are the fields. So first field is, let's say in the header section, the first field, let's call it the name of the facility, and it we need to give it a field type. So let's say we are giving it a varchar. So if we give a varchar, we get a small field like this. If we give text, we get a bigger text area. Date and time are self-explanatory. If we want a yes no toggling button, we can do this, or if we want to have a poll like good, fair, satisfactory, drop, poor, we can use this. And if we want to add a drop down menu, we can select this and then select the relevant drop down menu from here. I'll show that to you. Let's move on here. So next field is, let's say SOP number. Let's say this is also a varchar field, and we also need to say whether these fields are mandatory or not. Let's say all these fields are mandatory. Third field, let's say title of the SOP. So let's say this is also a varchar, and let's say this is also mandatory. Fourth field, let's say, is department. So the manager has already defined a drop down menu called department, so let's use that drop down menu. So instead of varchar here, I'm saying drop down menu, and I'll select a drop down menu, the department drop down menu, and I say yes, this is also mandatory. Then the fifth field out here, let's say the date on which this SOP was written, so it's a date field. So let's say this is mandatory. And then the last field is, let's say, effective date. So let's say this is also a date. Let's say this is not mandatory, just to show the difference. Let's say this is not mandatory. Now moving on to the second part, which is SOP details. The first thing out here is, let's say, objective. That's the first field, and let's say it's a text field. The second, and let's say it is mandatory. Second field out here is, let's say, scope, and let's give all these a text area so that we get a larger area to write as much as we want. So let's say this is also mandatory. Then the third field out here is, let's say, responsibility. Again, this we are giving it a text field because we want to give a lot of opportunity to write and make it a mandatory field. Then the fourth field out here, let's say it's called materials and equipment, and let's say this is similarly a text field. And moving on, the fifth field, let's say it's called procedure. This is also a text field, and let's say this is mandatory. Sixth field, let's call it reporting. Again, text, and let's say mandatory. Seventh field, let's say abbreviations, and let's say this is also a text field, and let's say this is also mandatory. And then we submit the form. So now if we go to view active forms, we see that this form, SOP for equipment qualification, has been added with your header, and this is the type of field that you're going to get. See, these 3 were the varchar fields, so we get smaller areas to fill in. Department is a drop down menu. We get all the departments that were defined by the manager. Date is a date field.
an effective date. And effective date, we made it non-mandatory, so the red asterisk doesn't appear here. So when a user fills out that field, he or she doesn't necessarily need to fill out this data. And then the others are coming out as text fields, and these text fields you don't need to cut and paste out here. You can write it out here just as you write in MS Word. You can just type in your data out here, and it appears. It has all the formatting options as you can see it out here. So all these we use as text. So this form has now, this SOP template has now been made. So now once the manager is convinced that this is a good template for SOP for equipment qualification, he can go ahead and publish this template. So while publishing, he needs to select the workflow that would be attached. That would, when a person fills out this template, what would be the workflow for approval of this template. So he sees that he has 2 workflows out of this. He selects this one and goes ahead and submit it. Now this SOP form is now available to his users for filling in, for making the different templates. So now let's log out as John and log in as another user, executive user. John was a manager user. Now we are logging in as an executive user. Let's say we are logging in as Trevor, who is an executive user. So once he goes into the BPM module, he can go and see his available forms out here. So these are the available forms that he can fill out. So he can go ahead and he can click on submit form, fill in the data, whatever data he needs to fill out. He can just fill in, he can type in all this data and then hit on the submit button. So instead of typing out so much, I have already filled out a form out here. So I'll just go there to my forms, newly added forms. I have already added this form out here which he has filled up. So once he fills up, this is how it's going to look like. He has filled in his objective, scope, responsibility, whatever materials and equipment, whatever the procedures, it comes out totally formatted just like as it comes out in MS Word. You can even put in colors to the text if you want, similar to MS Word. So now he checks all this, and then he, if there is an attachment that he has added, so he can add it. So after all this is done, if he wants, he can print it right now. If you could click on print, it would print it out as either on your printer, whatever you choose, whether on your printer or as a PDF document. So going back to the list, now he can send this SOP for approval. So once he sends it for approval, it will go to the first step approver, which would be Mary in this case. And then once Mary receives it, she can just approve it or reject it or ask for resubmission. And while doing so, she can add her electronic signature to it. The electronic signature of Mary is password protected, so she has to upload her signature and she password protects it. And then once she is approving this form, she attaches that signature to this form, and it goes on, and if she approves it, then it moves on to the next step, which is John. And once John approves it, this form comes back to Trevor, and then Trevor can go ahead and share this form with the other users, with the other BPM executive users who need to follow this SOP. So this users can then later on add relevant forms like maybe the deviation forms or something. If there's a deviation to that SOP, the users can attach that relevant deviation to that SOP and again submit it and send for approval. Again, that deviation would have a similar workflow attached to it. So depending on the workflow, the system would take care of the approval process. So this is how SOPs are completely managed and taken care of, and they're centrally managed using LuitBiz TMS. So this streamlines the whole SOP process, which is so very important right now in this COVID-19 times. So if you have any questions, we'll be very happy to answer you. Thank you for watching.